One of the most notable things about the ongoing war in Iran is how it keeps on confounding expectations. Few people expected Trump to start another war in the Middle East in the first place, given he essentially campaigned on a pro-peace ticket. And even when the war did kick off, most people didn't think it'd last long, at least judging by the relatively muted market reaction. So in this video, we thought we'd explain how game theory, which in this context essentially means focusing on Iranian and American decision-making strategies, can help explain how this all happened, and why it predicts a long war. On the night of the 2024 US election, Donald Trump told his supporters that God had saved his life for a reason, alluding to the assassination attempt on his life a few months earlier. In the latest edition of Too Long, we explore how faith-fueled populism, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, has slowly been reshaping modern democracy. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, before we get into why game theory predicts a long war in Iran, we should explain how game theory can also help us understand why the war kicked off in the first place. In short, one of the structural obstacles to a deal between the US and Iran was that Trump was apparently treating negotiations as a single game, while Iran was treating them more as a repeating or iterative game. For context, in game theory, each player in any game only has a limited number of options. During negotiations, Iran basically had two options: do a deal or go to war with the US and Israel. Given how the 12-day war panned out last year, war looked like a pretty terrible outcome from Iran's perspective. So Trump seems to have essentially assumed that Iran would accept any deal better than a war. This is why Trump started demanding so many concessions. Not only did he apparently insist on zero uranium enrichment, something the Iranians have long resisted, he also tried to expand the scope of negotiations, demanding Iran withdraw support for its proxy network and accept limits on the size and range of its ballistic missiles. Here, Trump seems to have basically argued that, given a war would be pretty terrible for Iran, the Iranians would make any and all concessions necessary to avoid it. Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff made this quite explicit during an interview with Fox News a couple of days before the first strikes, when he said the president was, quote, curious as to why the Iranians hadn't capitulated.
I know that we have red lines here from the U.S. How about over with Iran?
The president asked me that this morning, and I don't want to use the word frustrated. It's almost because he understands he's got plenty of alternatives. But it's curious. He's curious as to why they haven't, I don't want to use the word capitulated, but why they haven't capitulated. Why under this sort of pressure, with the amount of sea power, naval power that we have over there, why they haven't come to us and said, we profess that we don't want a weapon, so here's what we're prepared to do, and yet it's hard to sort of get them to that place.
Trump's apparent confusion here is understandable for someone treating the negotiation as a single game. After all, from Iran's perspective, any deal, even with massive concessions, would plausibly be better than a war. So why didn't they take it? Well, the fundamental reason seems to be that the Iranians were treating negotiations not as a single game, but as a repeating game. In other words, the Iranians were assuming there would effectively be multiple rounds of negotiations in the future. It's not hard to see why. The previous round of negotiations, which failed and ended in the 12-day war, occurred barely 6 months ago. Zooming out, you could argue that Iran has basically been in constant negotiations with the US since the early 2010s, culminating in the JCPOA in 2015, which was duly torn up by Trump in 2018, before Biden tried, but ultimately failed, to quietly revive it in the early 2020s. Anyway, this is why the Iranians were unwilling to meet Trump's demands. They worried that, if they did, the US and Israel would just come back asking for more down the line, as they have in the past. Instead, Iran's strategic priority was restoring deterrence. In other words, imposing enough costs on the US and Israel to deter them from coming back for more at a later date, even if that meant suffering some costs in the short term. In game theory terms, the Iranians were willing to essentially lose the single game because they thought that this would improve their lot in future games, and thus overall. This is one of the big reasons negotiations kept on getting stuck. In treating them like a single game, Trump assumed the Iranians would ultimately accept whatever concessions necessary to avoid war. But the Iranians, treating the negotiations as just one round in a repeating game, were reluctant to make concessions for fear of inviting further pressure down the line. Similarly, game theory explains why, once Trump had amassed all that firepower in the Middle East, war became essentially inevitable. This is because America and Israel's opening salvo was always going to be targeted at Iran's missile launchers to undermine their retaliatory capabilities. This created a use-it-or-lose-it incentive structure for Iran. In other words, they had to use their missile launchers and strike first, otherwise the launchers would be destroyed by Israel and America in their first strike. This then created an incentive for Israel and the US to strike even earlier, before Iran followed through on this logic. This would be consistent with comments made by Marco Rubio a couple of weeks ago, when he implied the US went to war with Iran only after Israel claimed they had to strike first because they had intel suggesting Iran was planning its own first strike. So that's how game theory can help us understand how we got here. What does it tell us about the future? Well, unfortunately, game theory predicts a long war in Iran, at least as we see it. This is for essentially two reasons. First, the US, or at least parts of the US policymaking apparatus, are now also treating this as a repeating game. This is essentially because Iran's de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been, from Iran's perspective, remarkably effective. By closing the strait, Iran has been able to dramatically push up global oil prices, imposing real costs on the US and its allies without meaningful disruption to their own oil exports. At least some American policymakers worry that pulling out now would teach Iran that, by closing the strait, they can essentially hold the global economy hostage whenever they want. With both sides treating this as part of a repeating game and trying to teach the other a long-term lesson, meaningful concessions look unlikely. Conversely, both sides have made some very maximalist demands that make it hard to imagine them agreeing to some middle ground. Trump has demanded Iran's unconditional surrender, while the Iranians have demanded the US wind down its military presence in the region, pay reparations, and guarantee against further aggression in the future. This brings us nicely onto the second reason that it's hard to see the war ending anytime soon. Trump fundamentally lacks the credibility to make a deal at the moment. Not only did Trump unilaterally withdraw from the JCPOA, he's also twice gone to war in the middle of negotiations with Iran. This creates another structural problem. Even if Trump were to nominally agree to some of Iran's demands, which feels unlikely at the moment, this still probably wouldn't be enough for the Iranians, because they wouldn't be able to trust him to keep his word. The point we're trying to make is that the absence of trust essentially precludes a stable negotiated settlement, which suggests we're in for a long war that will require a creative solution. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it'll be shipped to you immediately, and if you buy a digital edition, it'll land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there using code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles.
The New Age of Empires. Written and read by Georgina Finley.
If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That gets you a copy of the magazine, but also access to TLDR Party, our new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series Leaders and Losers and our upcoming documentary we're recording in Greenland right now. They get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.